Here on stage, we're going to move these tables and set things a little bit different as we get ready for our next panel. The next panel is going to be a robust conversation amongst amazing leaders in our state who work firsthand every day on issues of equity and education from early childhood all the way through high school, and including after-school programs. You will love the leadership, the ideas, the inspiration that this panel has to share. We're going to make a little transition with a video that talks a bit about superheroes that we are finding in classrooms across the state. So you can watch the video, and then we'll bring you back here in a second.
My superheroes come by foot, car, or bus. Some wear the latest fashion trends or Muslim attire. They sling backpacks filled with books. They saunter through the halls as they make their way to classes. They are multilingual and multicultural. My superheroes navigate an educational system that doesn't often understand or have knowledge of their stories. Stories that show their superhuman characteristics. You see, when a student has to take 3 buses to get to school and drop her sibling off on the way, that's superhuman. Taking a plethora of advanced placement and international baccalaureate classes, including advanced placement calculus, maintaining a stellar GPA while holding a job and looking after younger siblings, that's superhuman. My superheroes are undocumented but contribute members to our community. They don't want a handout, just an opportunity to show their value. My superheroes have to listen to others tell them to go back to their own country when this is the only country that they've ever known. My superheroes meet with me on weekends to study. They sit with me during their winter break to get caught up on their schoolwork. My superheroes come to school early and stay late after the school day ends. They challenge people who hold low expectations for them. They debate controversial topics with the prowess of a college professor. They know that the amount of melanin in their skin often brings about prejudgments of who they are. My superheroes may look like ordinary teenagers living ordinary lives. However, this teacher sees extraordinary individuals living extraordinary lives. This teacher sees superheroes.
One last-minute request that got us off pace by just 20 seconds or so here. But we're setting up for this next panel, and as I indicated when we started, made this transition, this is a panel on education and equity with leaders in our community and our state who work every day on this issue. They are here to share their views and their experiences all first person. So please welcome our panel to this, and we'll let them get settled. So our panel member names are listed both on your program and on the PowerPoint slide there. But I just wanted to make sure I welcomed our good friends. First, Jennifer Godinez is with us with the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership. Give a little wave, Jennifer. Thank you. Barb Faber from the White Earth Nation is here, made the drive last night, so thank you for that. Ann DeGroot is here today and wearing 2 hats. Of course, she works with the Minneapolis Youth Coordinating Board, but she's also here as a board member for Ignite After Schools. Dr. Kimberly Mader is here, and thank you. Welcome, and she's with the West Metro Education District or program. Bao Tao Urabe is here with us with the Coalition for Asian American Leaders. Welcome and good morning. And Kleber Ortiz is here with the Social Studies Content Lead in Minneapolis Public Schools. So thank you for being with us. And finally, our moderator today is Anthony Galloway. Anthony is the Student Program Lead at West Metro Education Programs. I first became familiar with Anthony because he was one of the active voices on an NPR podcast called Counter Stories. If you haven't heard that, go look it up on the NPR website. They must have 30 or 40 podcasts, great information. But please welcome our moderator today, Anthony Galloway.
Thank you. So as you can see, we've removed the tables and made as much of a half circle as possible. We're going to have this conversation differently. Too many times we sit in a space where we do little changes to the ways we've done things for years. And as a person of color myself, I am more interested in completely redesigning spaces to be more like home, okay? And not just minor adjustments. And so for our panel today, we're going to have a conversation amongst leaders from various areas and various sectors and talk to each other. I'm going to give questions to us, but as we respond to those questions or add on to those questions, I would like us to first start with what I heard you say, okay? And so as we go through and answer those questions, what I heard you say allows us to, one, put in context and make sure that what we have heard or what we're responding to is within the context and meaning of the person who spoke before, and so that we can frame our discussion so it's easy to follow. Okay. It also acknowledges that we are listening as we are talking. All right. So Kleber Ortiz Sinchi. I need to make sure your indigenous identity is acknowledged and respected. Right. You are the student social studies content lead for Minneapolis Public Schools, and I would like you to, if possible, from your perspective, to define equity within that context and some of the common misconceptions that we have around that for the panel and for our listeners.
First of all, good morning to everybody. And I'm honored to be here. You know, we have some wonderful educators up here and people that I love and respect. But first of all, I just want to start out with saying that, you know, and this is something my sister, I saw her up here. She was with a parent from St. Paul. I don't know where she's at, but she said, we have so many geniuses in the room, right? And I want to just channel that because I think that that's important. Everybody here is a genius, and everybody here is an expert in their own capacity, in their own reality. I want us first to begin with a quote from Frederick Douglass. As you know, it is Black History Month, but not just this one, right? It should be every day that we're thinking about the histories of our different people. And his quote that I always come back to, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I would say broken adults. And so with this quote, I want to dive into our conversation today. As we think about equity, one of the things that, you know, when we looked at first the picture, I think it's very important that we talk about this common misconception between equity and equality. So what I've been hearing today, or what I heard today, was all children. All children. Yes, that's equity. Well, that's equality, but that's not equity, right? So we need to redefine that and say all children. Some children deserve or need more opportunities because those opportunities have been taken away for many, many, many years. Also, as we think about equity, we need to have community input. We cannot do this in isolation as educators, our experts that have read the research. We need to dive with our community. We need to bring our community in, and we need to have them also be part of the conversation what equity means to their children, not us putting upon them what we believe equity should be. When equity I'm also thinking about how do we allow for the recreation of the world, right? Many times when we think about equity, we think about standards, especially in education. We think about, you know, the IB program, the AP program, and having all those programs that we believe is equity. But in reality, we also need to understand and begin to impose, right? We don't want to impose our worldviews on our students and our communities. We need to help them redefine what those standards should be. We need to help, or we need them to redefine what a good education should be, right? What a quality education should be, because it doesn't look the same in all of our communities. For some of us, you know, for my own parents, for my own background, a quality education is love at school, right? It means safety at school. It means respect at school. It doesn't just mean a teacher has all the technological tools to be successful. It also means how are we connecting with our community? How many times have parents come into the space in order for them to be able to volunteer and have access to what the teacher is doing, instead of seeing that as a threat, seeing that as a strength that we should be having at our different schools and our different sites. And the last thing that I want to point out is that I think the misunderstanding a lot of times is that it's only for students of color. It's only for students at risk. Equity is for everybody. One of the things that, you know, the research that is recently coming out specifically around ethnic studies is that our students, our white students, our middle and upper class students, our students that have, you know, money and that have all the opportunities also need equity training, also need equity education, because they have to be able to become allies in order for us to have an equitable opportunity in our education, and not just in our education, in our society as well. And, you know, things that I always come back to as a misconception as well, or a misunderstanding about equity, is that we always bring in this naive consciousness, right? So if you are not familiar with that, so there's 3 levels of consciousness, but naive consciousness is this middle level of consciousness where we know what the problem, or we think we know what the problem is. And we try to address it by throwing money at it, by throwing you know, strategies at it, but we don't address the human needs of our students. And I think that when we become critical in our consciousness, we begin to look at the systematic way that our education and our society has made it so that the inequalities exist today. So the opportunity gap that exists today is not because our system is broken. Our system is doing exactly what it was meant to do. And in order for us to change that, we need to look at it from an equity perspective and really look at our community needs. What are the strengths in the community? Not always talk about our communities like they're broken and they need fixing, but what are the strengths of our communities, and how can we provide more opportunities to make sure that everybody is able to achieve at a higher level?
So, okay, start off with the mic drop. So, I'm going to put my computer away and let's get into it. If I can have us move more of a U shape, because I'm going to have you talk to each other, okay? Not too far, Clever. I don't want you to fall off, okay? So, if I could have you, as you think about things that Clever shared, just to share what you heard, okay, from your perspective. We can just pass the mic and get some of those responses in before we move on to the next question. So what did you hear Clever say from your perspective?
Well, if I could speak to that, what I heard you say, I have to practice.
Talk to him.
Okay. What I heard you say was that the system is broken. And so, you know, we've been trying to solve the race equity and education issue, and I want to continue to use race equity because we have to name what's happening. We have certain racial categories, racial groups that are left behind: African American, Latino, American Indian, Asian. We have to name that. If the system is broken, if they've been left behind, then what are the systemic reforms? It's not about more after-school programs. It's not more early childhood. So I'd just like to address from the MNEP perspective, Minnesota Education Equity Partnership, 2 of our 5 big, bold goals that our board of directors wanted to get at causes and what we're working on. One of them is the policies that school boards use to address race and culture. So we have a pilot project, and there's many partners involved in this in the Mille Lacs region with 3 school districts. They created a race equity action plan. They document what is it about American Indian history, the boarding school era, so actually explaining to others why people have been left behind, that it was implicit, it was strategic, it was genocide. And then we look at the gaps, right? So American Indian children are not less intelligent than white students. The historical context matters. So we're talking about school policies, and then our second goal, because I want to hear other panelists, of course, is to work on the over-suspension rate of black young men in this state. So we have a coalition, we're working with others, and we're trying to work with districts, of course, and community to have that voice in terms of how do we reshape those cultures, student engagement. And we have a coalition called the Solutions Not Suspensions Coalition. And in 2 weeks, that coalition will release a statewide policy reform that our lieutenant governor and our governor can take into consideration to change the systemic root problem of suspensions in this state. So those are just 2 of our 5 big, bold goals, but I want to hear others.
So what I hear both Jennifer and Clyburn say is really that the system was created when the student body looked different, right? And where are the opportunities for redesign? If your student population changes, how are you engaging the community that is in the system now, right? And we know that in this state, kids of color are the fastest growing and make up the largest proportion of our kids who are in K through 12. And so when I say that, how do we not just start from the perspective of saying, who are these kids, but where is there really opportunity for these communities and all of us to participate in the redesign instead of trying to figure out tools to measure how these kids fit into a system that wasn't designed for these kids, right?
Hi. First of all, I just want to say I'm really honored to be here in this conversation with all of you on the stage audience. I'm just learning or getting to know everyone, but I've had opportunity to work with Clever for a period of time in Minneapolis Public Schools, and I appreciate him so much. And what I heard you say, Clever, is that when you said it's not just for people of color, but it's for all people, my takeaway from that is when we think about making sure that all of our stakeholders understand what equity is and racial equity, we have to remember that we don't have multiple perspectives always at the table when you're making decisions, when you're building policy, when you're developing programs, when you're designing instruction. We heard earlier that the statistics around the shortage of staff of color. Someone talked about earlier, when I go to a meeting, I see the commissioner is the only person of color in the room. I attend meetings where I'm the only person of color in the room. And we have a lot of decision makers who don't understand equity sometimes, and they're making decisions, and that error in decision making perpetuates some of the disparities. And so I really appreciate Representative Thiessen earlier talking about these disparity notes, to give pause to think about the decisions that we're making and the impact that they have on families and communities of color. So I appreciate your sharing that perspective and putting that into the room. And also, I wanted to touch on Jennifer's statement about the assumptions that we make around our students entering into education in the first place. We always think of our students of color coming in at a deficit when they actually have a lot of strengths that we don't recognize. And so we immediately begin to remediate. And we need to really focus on acceleration, not remediation, by building upon their strengths, their cultural assets, and their language assets. And so I appreciate putting those perspectives into the space.
I'm going to jump to you, Barb, because as you respond, I also want you to share First Nation perspectives. If we live in the state where You know, just to give some context and examples, if we talk about Dakota peoples in the in Minnesota in particular, we live in the state where the term redskin was coined. We live in the state where one of the most sacred sites for some of our First Nation peoples is also, unfortunately, the site of the largest concentration camp in America's history as it relates to Native peoples, and the place where you as a white settler would turn in your scalp to receive payment, sometimes is high enough, if you adjust for inflation, to cover a year's worth of farm wage. So we have a lot of history there. So as you share, I would also like you to speak on some of your work in the White Earth Reservation as a member of the Ojibwe community to bring that perspective in there for us.
Miigwech, and I am very honored to be here. And I am from the White Earth Reservation. I'm a member. I've been advocating for children and Native American children for almost 30 years. I'm a recovering school board member for 8 years. So I feel the pressure there. However, you know, right now I'm in early childhood, and so with that, we know, and I'm preaching to the choir here, that 80% of the child's brain is developed by age 3. The brain research tells us this. And, you know, I look back at Dr. Todd Risley's work on Meaningful Differences, his book, and he talks about families from middle-income families, children from middle-income families arriving at kindergarten with a 20,000-word vocabulary. Children from low-income families, especially children of color, arriving with 3,000 to 4,000-word vocabulary. Those are our kids. Those are the Native American kids, the African American kids. And so the achievement gap starts there. And if we know that 80% of their brain is developed by age 3, it kind of, you know, shows the picture that where we need to work. A friend of mine, Nancy Jose, who's just a huge advocate, has always sent me great information. And when she sent me this from the Institute for Child Success, when brain science meets public policy. So we have years of brain research, and I believe that our legislators, our policymakers, school districts need to look at the science and design policies, set the funding to brain research. Because our young children, they need those regulation skills. They need the literacy to increase their vocabulary. And so it's sort of a cycle, and we need to start early. We need to keep the learning going as our children enter kindergarten and elementary. And then we have our adolescents, who are usually, you know, they're so full of hormones at that age, and their brain is still developing. And to hear the legislator this morning say that for every adolescent school child out there, it's one counselor to 800. That's just not right. So we need to set policies that make a difference on the developing brain. And we also, when we talk about equity, we need to empower our youth to become leaders. We got to nurture them. We need to have people of color on school boards. We need to have more people of color on city council and in the legislature. And I believe that's where we're going to get people to really understand. How many of you have ever been to a tribal reservation in rural Minnesota? Great. They're really pockets of poverty. high poverty. They're very isolated. I've lived there for all my life. And our families and our children and our youth, sometimes when they're in these isolated communities, they feel very depressed. And there's, you know, and that comes from a lot of things. It comes from low self-esteem, the historical trauma. You know, if we were to do an ACE score on them, I'm sure they would all be scoring very high. So it all has an effect on how they perceive themselves, how they perceive their community, and how they perceive the world. So in these communities, in these very rural communities, I visited a family last week, and the mother was in a wheelchair. She lived about 30 miles out, no vehicle, with young children. She just got her children back, and she said, I'm trying to stay clean. She said, but it's really hard. I don't have transportation. I don't have a healthy community. And so for us, those are the kind of families that we really reach out to, especially for Race to the Top. We had the early learning scholarships, and you know, it was a short-term grant. I say short-term because we need more funding for long-term. Yes, stay the course, Minnesota. If we want to really make an effect, we have to stay the course. And early learning scholarships worked. And for this young woman, scholarships would mean the world to her. We connect her with the transportation. We get her into a training. We support her sobriety. And we give her things to look forward for. So I guess in short.
And I would ask then for Anne and for Val, or Dr. Mateer and Jennifer and Kleber, as you respond, feel free to talk to and engage each other, right? Because you come from different sectors that have different insights. And so as you say, start with what I heard you say was, please feel free to connect and to ask questions to pull out some of those promising practices, as Jennifer shared with two of the big goals from MNEP, Minnesota Educational Equity Partnership, for the acronym folks in the room.
Well, what I hear everyone say is that, lots of things, but two things I'll say. One is that we get the system we wanted, and secondly is that equity is for everybody. And so I think about myself as a white woman, nearing the end of my career, but not too quick, don't get excited. How do I use that to help work, to be a good ally? So how do I use that position that I'm in, both in my job and who I am, to work with other white people, but also to be a good ally? And so I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And one of the places that I work on that right now is in my role with After School. And Carrie Dennis and Kuneen asked me to just say hello. She couldn't be here. She has a family emergency. So I'm sitting in for her. And that is to say that we know that after school activities help kids do better. We have data that shows that after school can close the achievement gap. So it's one place that I'm trying to spend some time now to help people understand the importance of after school, and that it's not just extra, it's core. And we don't think about it that way, but we know that for a lot of children of color, children who live in poverty, children who are isolated in some way or another, do better when they have activities after school that help them to be able to expand and to practice and to do things that maybe they're good at, they're not in school. So that's what I'm here about.
I said I'd only mention two of our goals, but I have to mention another one. I hear all of the panelists talking about this 4% teachers of color crisis we have in this state. Why is it a crisis? Research shows that for white children and children of color to only see 4% people of color teaching them the false sense of who is intelligent in this society and who they should learn from. So our organization, along with some others that are actually represented here, have built a coalition and have talked about a policy agenda where we would go to the state and actually make the teacher of color issue not just a diversity issue, but a state workforce goal, so that we increase. Thank you. And I think this is really important. So everybody here, I kind of feel people nodding their head about this issue, and the issue of predominantly white female teachers teaching a new multiracial, multicultural, emerging population it's all right, we need more diversity. So please sign on to that agenda. We, at our website, mneep.org, mneep.org, we'll show you the policies that have been proposed for recruiting more teachers, for retaining them, and also for success in terms of a long-term successful career. Teens of color leave the field faster. You know, if teachers in general leave the field, it's even more so. And we know that current school systems, their human resource departments have a lot to do with this problem. So how people feel welcome, how they feel included in school systems is a major issue. So we know we'll need a state shift, but we all know that there's many school board members in this room. We know that there's people who work with their school districts. We need to have a serious conversation about how those systems are retaining our teachers of color. But please, hopefully, in terms of addressing that issue, I heard everybody address it, so I wanted to talk about it.
And so, Bao and Dr. Mateer, to the point, coalition, right? So Jennifer, you do a lot of work on the policy level piece, right? And I know, Bao, you work, you were appointed by President Obama to address issues for Asian Pacific Islanders. Dr. Mateer, you help lead a region, a coalition of districts. How does that coalition work together in some ways? Experience in really pulling out some of those promising practices in support of some of these larger policy issues that are being addressed statewide.
Do you want to go first? Okay. Well, I think Jennifer points out a really good perspective in terms of what's the question we should be asking ourselves, right? And I think what we're talking about is preparing our future in Minnesota when we're talking about our children, and then when we hone in and talk about kids of color, right? Hence the whole conversation about equity is for everyone. And in that future, we need every child to be successful, right, in our education system, and we need them to be more globally fluent, right? Our future is not going to just be in Minnesota. And so when we start, then we have to look at what we're starting with, right? And when we look at what we're starting with in the state of Minnesota, as I said, students of color, young people of color, are the fastest growing demographics, right? There's nothing we can do about that, just in case people are wondering. But while disparities look different for different populations, I think the overarching notion that kids of color have is that you are better off going somewhere else, right, if you want to succeed. And so I think for us, we have to say, why is that, right? So it's not just that it's bad for a specific population of color or kids of color, it's bad for every kid of color in the state. So why are so many smart people in the state not finding better solutions, right? And I think part of that has to do with kids feeling invisible. They don't see themselves, right? And that invisibility happens because really smart people often want simple information, right? We want to not really get to hear the stories of different students or parents and how they are experiencing the system, but we want it in really nice reports. And often nice reports give us just aggregate data, right? And that aggregate data doesn't really tell us the story of anybody. And so at the coalition, we push for, and we ourselves look at disaggregated data, right? And when I say disaggregated data, I'm not talking about some one term. I'm just talking about how do we segment our communities and look at them from multiple points of view, right? And when we do this, we know that in the Asian American community, almost 3 out of 4 students are classified as English learners, right? Why? One, is that a good or a bad thing when we look at further data and see that that's actually the population that's falling through the cracks, right? So while the graduation rate might be close to the general population, their average ACT score is 18, right? At 18, probably most good universities wouldn't accept them, except we do make exceptions, and they go, and then, President Obama's, My Brother's Keeper found that African-American young men and Asian and are most likely to be in remedial classes their first year, right? So it means they're not ready. They're not ready for college, and that means they're not going to be ready for careers, right? So that invisibility that we cause as adults when we're trying to understand kids, I think is problematic, and it doesn't mean that we don't have the data, but we often don't look at that data from different perspectives, nor do we make that data available to communities so that they can better tell the stories of themselves and they can also participate. And when we ask parents and students, they say they want to see themselves reflected in the education staffing. They want to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. They feel the education system erases who they are, right? And that's a sad state for us, right? And also, kids who come into our system speaking another language want that to be viewed as an asset, not a push for English acquisition and a testing of that English as the standard by which they're doing well or not. And also, how do we support first-generation students? Because in this state, over 50% of the Asian American students come from those families, right? And they're the ones who are not doing well either.
So what I heard in the conversations resonate with me personally, professionally, and organizationally in terms of my role. I just want to share just a quick story because there was a lot of conversation about access to opportunity. And although throughout my K-12 education, I never had a teacher of color. My father was in the Air Force, and we moved around every 2 years. And the first time I had a teacher of color is when I went to Oracle Black College. So I remember in school, teachers making a lot of assumptions about me. And my mother was an educator. And so she was always educating us at home, giving us what we couldn't get in the public school. Times we were in the military schools, but there were a lot of assumptions made about me, and I remember those. And I remember experiences in the classroom when a teacher would introduce a novel that used the N-word. And I remember crawling under my desk, even though I had self-esteem. I love being black, African-American female. I love that. My parents instilled that in me. But I remember crawling under my desk because every time the N-word was read, we were doing a play, we were reading the play out loud, everybody would turn and look at me. And the teacher never said a word. And the crazy thing is, I just recently moved to Minnesota, and I was doing site visits. And I was visiting classrooms, and I saw students. And I was in an AP English Lit class, by the way, advanced placement. And so I had access to the opportunity, although I had to fight for it, and my mother had to go to the school board. So once I got the opportunity, then I felt marginalized and isolated. And when I came to the state of Minnesota and I was visiting classrooms, I actually saw students of color in these advanced opportunities experiencing the same thing that I experienced 30 years ago. Their body language, just the discomfort, and the teachers not preparing the class for that, the other students looking at them. And so it's not just students are feeling isolated, and what I heard Jennifer say is that the adults of color feel too, because there are so few of them. And so one of the things that we're doing at West Metro Education Program is creating affinity groups, racial affinity groups, so that teachers can come together who are isolated and have support and create professional development. I also experienced that as a school principal, where I was the only staff person of color over an all-white staff. And so the assumptions that were made about me and the pushback that I got from staff not wanting to do anything that a black woman was telling them to do. That was best for students. And so I was lucky enough to have a superintendent who recognized some of the challenges for staff of color and created affinity groups for the principals of color. And they came together and talked about the challenges and talked about ways to help staff unpack their unconscious bias and assumptions that they make about them. And so that's some of the work that we also do at West Metro Education Program, is we do adult training to help unpack the behaviors that are unconscious most of the time, sometimes conscious, but behaviors that they have towards colleagues of color, students of color, so forth and so on. So those are really important things that we have to address, and we have to hold people accountable. I heard someone earlier say accountability, and accountability doesn't have to, I'm banging you over the head. I did a research study that looked at the schools who were the most successful, and they had a variety of configurations, a variety of settings, but they all talked about accountability. We hold each other accountable, and I heard somebody talk about that earlier. I wish I could remember the face and the name, but there is a way that we can hold each other accountable to get this work done, and that's what it's going to take. We don't have the luxury to opt out of this work, because there are going to continue to be consequences for our families and our communities if we do not address this.
So there's an important piece in that accountability, okay? And I'm clever, I'm gonna have you kind of round us out, but in that accountability, what I'm hearing in that theme is that accountability can't rely solely on the numbers or the folks around who raise that particular issue. Because if that's the case, then our numbers start to work against us. So as our accountability go just for the folks who might believe it, who might be members of dominant culture, does that accountability stop if there are not communities of color who have access to that particular table, that particular zone of influence? And what are we putting in place structurally to make sure that we set up communities of color to be able to hold us accountable? There right now is a demonstration of janitors in Minneapolis who are demonstrating, and a spokesperson on KDWB on Facebook talking about them demonstrating has already in the social media forum that it's too bad that the sergeant in St. Paul who just resigned for making the comment about running demonstrators over is not still on the job, because he would know what to do about these janitors demonstrating. So we are not removed from this even this morning. So Clever, as you kind of close us out, I want to think about what we've heard today and how you're going to put in structures that create access to communities for the purpose of holding us accountable.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here, like I said at the beginning, and it's just the wealth of knowledge that I was able to gain. And, I want to thank everybody else that was earlier and everybody that is here. One of the things that I want to come back to, and I think my sister, the parent from St. Paul, and I thank you so much for being here, because I know that as a parent, it's very hard sometimes with the jobs and the kids and all the other things that we have to do and battle. And even as you walk spaces like this, right, spaces as hotels as this, sometimes we're not seen as valuable enough. And so it's hard for us sometimes when they invite us to the table to be part of that conversation because of the initial reaction that we get. And so I want to thank that, and I think that one of the things I want to stress is this, Dr. Matier talked about her story. My story is very similar. I came to the U.S. when I was 10 years old, didn't know any English. I was in ESL courses, and then I was transferred into regular, IB, and then eventually into college. But in those spaces, I always had to not talk about who I was as a Latino, right, as an indigenous man. And so if I wanted to be successful in those advanced classes and those opportunities that were given to me because I was a student of color, I couldn't come out and say I love myself for being brown, right? And I love my family and I love my community, and things that were taught in the classroom sometimes contradicted that. And so when we think about those opportunities, we need to bring the community to the table. We need to bring parents to the table. We need to bring students to the table, right? Because a lot of times we're making decisions that we're like, this is for students. And it's like, how many students are in the room? Yeah, so how do you know it's going to work, right? And so making sure that those people are at the table and making sure that we, again, as adults are understanding that our young people are changing every day as well, right? So I believe the disconnect, and I'll end with this, there's a disconnect between our young people and our adults, because a lot of times we have gone through a system and we believe we know what's best for our young people. And just to give you a quick example, my son, his mother is from Mexico. I'm from Ecuador, and he was born in the United States. He goes with his mom, he eats tortillas, home, he eats rice, he goes to school, he eats hamburgers, right? And so that's not my experience, but I have to always refer back to him and ask him questions so that I understand, or try to at least begin to understand what he's going through at school. And so that's what we need to do in order to reach equity. And one of the last is also, when we look at the graphs, and you saw that everybody had one kind of stepping stone. And then in the next one, there was 3 for one student, and then 1 for the one student that was taller. When we think about losing something in equity, because that was never addressed in our conversation, was that people are going to lose something when people of color and other communities gain something. But that losing piece cannot always be this mentality that something is taken away, something good is being taken away. We need to think about losing as shedding that skin or that bad ideology and that media, perceptions and stereotypes that have been put in upon us. So again, thank you so much.
So I'll bring us home. Okay? So what I heard all of you say is that there are important people. I'm not even going to lie. I'm going to get my notes. Okay. See if Dragon Naturally Speaking actually did its job. So what I heard you say are themes of seeing and honoring me as I am in this work. I saw themes of how we build coalition and hold ourselves accountable. I heard and saw themes of making sure that our policy work is in alignment to who we want to be interracially and equitably in the future. I heard that we need to address the invisible communities, or the things that make us invisible, in our action and in our coalition building. I heard that in our First Nation communities in particular, but in all of our communities, how important it is in that early sense to make sure that from 0 to 3, 0 to 5, that we are holding up the best that we can to support our students in their early brain development. And I heard themes of allyship. So whether it's during school or after school, how we are, and this was echoed for many folks, creating spaces where all of us can be to learn to make decisions more equitably, whether that is as a white ally or as a person of color enduring in our state. And what I'll leave you with as a charge is, how are you holding up these themes as allies, as people of color? That is going to be the perfect piece that we need to add on there. So if this conversation ends here at this panel, then we lost, y'all. If our conversation only stays in the realm of being nice, we've lost. If our conversation stops at who we're going to make uncomfortable, we've lost. So I'm leaving you with the charge to keep those themes going and to make some folks uncomfortable. I appreciate y'all, and I appreciate you on this panel.